Welcome, everybody, to the Waxcast podcast. I am your host, Gavin Wax. Today is episode 4, even though it is our second day. It's been a high-energy start for this new podcast that I came up with yesterday at noon. But I'm happy to be joined by another good friend of mine, Mr. Dylan Stevenson, who also most recently ran as a Republican in the 10th Congressional District here in New York against Representative Jerry Nadler, who you may know is the gentleman whose pants reach his neck. And he's also a writer for the Imaginative Conservative, the American Conservative, and the Salisbury Review. And as a patriotic American, he is in the process of joining the Army Reserve. Is that correct?
It's the New York National Guard, but it's a reserve component of that. So yes.
Perfect. The New York Army National Guard Reserve component. Anyway, without further ado, Stephen, welcome.
Great to be here.
Dylan, welcome. My bad.
Yeah, that happens all the time. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it immensely.
Yes, absolutely. So you wrote a recent piece in the American Conservative on the history of populism here in the United States. You dated it to the late 1890s, 1880s with the rise of William Jennings Bryan, and you tied it in with monetary policy, namely with the bimetallism controversy between free silver and the gold bugs, etc. I thought it was a really interesting piece, and it was coming at populism from a historical angle that you don't really hear much about. My first question, though, leading into this is, would you not date the rise of populism in this country even earlier, maybe with the Jacksonian movement in the 1820s or 1830s? What was the significance of the timeline that you chose?
Yeah, so there are lots of different starting points that you could pick. Andrew Jackson is obviously a big one as well on account of the impact that he did have on the American currency. But I like to consider sort of the early modern iteration as opposed to the early republic version as beginning in monetarily 1873 with the passing of the Resumption Act, which made the US a fully gold standardized economy, and then really emerging as a political force in its own right at various points kind of over the 1880s, but mainly 1892 with the presidential campaign of James Weaver. Then 1896 you had William Jennings Bryan. 1908 as well you had another Jennings Bryan campaign, and then by the 1912 to 1920, he was Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson, was able to enact a lot of his policies there. So you have that kind of time frame. It can vary. Andrew Jackson is considered, I guess, the first populist. But when you look at the history of the United States, the early republic before the Civil War, and then after that, generally sort of the three chunks that you divide it into. So that's how I kept my division there.
Interesting. Now, you also basically tie in sort of loose monetary policy and more, inflationary policy with populism, and you contrast this with, say, the more established order, who have, interests in preserving their savings and their wealth and having tighter monetary policy. But you've also pointed out things like the Ron Paul movement, which was very populist in nature, very grassroots in nature, but wasn't necessarily an inflationist movement. So how do you make that distinction?
Yeah, so it's the result of William Jennings Bryan's influence on the Woodrow Wilson administration and then American policy long after him is to note how the beneficiaries of inflation flipped between the end of the 1800s and the start of this century. So in the 1890s, when populism was coming up, the people who were most indebted in the United States were rural farmers in the west of America. The 1800s was the manifest destiny time. Lots of these farmers were taking out what were originally very cheap and easy loans to buy this land, and then would use the crops from the sales from the crops to pay the debts back. Inflation benefits people who hold debt. If you are able to sell, your crops or your mining equipment or whatnot for $3 instead of $2, then it's much easier to pay back a $10 debt, for instance.
Of course.
Deflation is the exact opposite. If that price goes down to $1, you have to sell more of it to make that up. So inflation in the 1890s really helped, or would really help, the farmers and working class Americans who had a lot of debt. But what happened was, over the course of the 1900s, the people who held debt flipped. You had the gold standard gradually drift away, between the 1890s and then permanently in 1971 with Richard Nixon. You had the establishment of the Federal Reserve and various different monetary laws that passed over the course of the 1900s. So what the working class and rural Americans used those new rules and restrictions to pay back the debts that they had owed. on the flip side, corporate America, who they had previously been indebted to, wound up in a situation where there were now no real limits on how much they could borrow. With the gold standard, you actually had to be able to, bring up the gold if you were going to borrow stuff. So there were limits that were no longer in place. And what happened over the course of particularly the latter half of the 20th century was that these companies took on massive, massive, massive amounts of debt. I think Bear Stearns, the day before it went bust, for instance, was levered at 44 times. That means their debt load was 44 times larger than their EBITDA, which is just astounding. And so now inflationary policy, and what they mean by stimulus is printing more money. What they mean by when they say that is an inflationary policy that massively benefits corporate America. It keeps the cash flow going. It makes it easier to keep those debt serviced. But now that inflationary policy hurts the rural and working Americans who've paid off those debts from the 1800s and now have those hard family assets. So now that they've paid off the debt on the farm, the family farm, now that family farm is valued not quite as well as it once was because of inflation. Their savings aren't going as far. Things are more expensive. So that is what has flipped. And so.
Well, would you not, I mean, to be the devil's advocate here, would you not also agree that there is a massive amount of consumer debt still in this country? Obviously, the corporations are leveraged, but there's also corporate debt. I mean, there's also student debt. There's also consumer debt, credit card debt, et cetera, not to mention, mortgages and the whole housing market. So isn't there not still a large component of people within the populist movement who would be in favor of looser monetary policies?
I think it's certainly possible. And the distinction that I make is the difference between relative debt burden and absolute debt burden.
Interesting. Okay.
As of today, for instance, there are, I think the student debt load is $1.5 trillion across the 44 million Americans who currently hold student debt, which is a lot. I'm certainly not saying it isn't. But it is worth comparing that to the $20 trillion or so spread across the Fortune 500. So you wind up with kind of this massively higher numerator and significantly lower denominator. So the corporate and Wall Street debt is absolutely a concern, and student debt is a relative concern. Certainly a concern, but slight distinction.
Now, do you think populism in the U.S. is unique in its how intertwined it is with monetary policy? I mean, you could compare it to populist movements abroad in Europe, et cetera. I mean, I'm not sure which ones you could necessarily point to. I guess maybe Bonapartism in France, or could you even describe Thatcherism as a type of populist movement? I'm not sure. I mean, those are just two that came to the top of my mind. But Francoism in Spain, Peronism in Argentina, et cetera, do they all have similar ties to monetary policy as the populist movement in the U.S. has over the last 200 years? I
think just given the nature of this, most of the world's silver is mined in the west of the United States. The bimetallism thing was kind of unique to the United States. But when you look at monetary policy and its impact on populist movements, it's certainly hard. Certainly in Germany and Russia, for instance, in the early 20th century, the massive hyperinflation that was there certainly did contribute to populist movements. In those cases, really quite detrimentally. When you look at modern Europe, I think that a lot of the anti-EU populism that we see can come from partially the dissatisfaction with the ECB and the issuance of the euro and the way that organization has overridden national sovereignty. Whereas, populism in France with the Bonapartism, which we mentioned, certainly in the First French Republic, with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte I, Napoleon III wouldn't have been that. That would have been more political dissatisfaction with the way the Second Republic was functioning. So I think it varies, but there are certainly other populist movements where monetary policy will play a role. And the worse a monetary situation is, the more significant an impact that will have on populism and the policies thereof.
And the society as a whole, as many of the old kind of gold bug, libertarian, anti-Fed commentators always used to bring up, especially in the aftermath of the '08 financial crisis. But bringing it now to the modern era with the rise of Trumpism as the newfound right-wing populism in the United States. I mean, he being Trump has come out in favor of lower interest rates, looser monetary policies. You could argue that much of that came from his time in real estate, where he was the beneficiary of easier loans. How do you think, with the Trump movement, your theory on monetary policy and populism come into play?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. I think that there's, when we think of the monetary side of populism, Ron Paul would be the originator of that with his hostility towards the Federal Reserve and centralized control over the currency. And again, these massive rounds of stimulus that are greatly beneficial to the stock market, but maybe not so beneficial to everyone else. Trump is he seems to jump back and forth across the line a lot. On the one hand, he would support almost negative interest rates and a looser monetary policy to keep the economy, to keep booming the economy, perhaps beyond where it was where it was over the last 4 years. But at the same time, on the other side of that equation, he basically every time he gives a speech will talk about how your savings aren't going as far. The job that used to provide the ability to buy a house and take a vacation every now and then and pay off the car and all that now doesn't. And he does seem to want to be, or certainly did seem to want to fix that. So he's on both sides of that. I think he understands that there are pros and cons to either side. And depending on the issue in question, he seems to discuss it differently. So going forward, it will be interesting to see which side of that monetary position the populist movement in the United States takes. Frankly, I'm not quite sure what that would be, but it'll be interesting to watch.
And I mean, with the recent COVID pandemic and the stimulus that we've had over the last, year, the Fed's balance sheet has only grown. The amount of spending out of Congress has only grown. I can only imagine that monetary policy will come back to the forefront in terms of discussions in the political arena. I mean, how do you see this playing out over the next few years? I mean, there has to be some kind of inflationary response to this. I mean, a lot of the criticism of the old libertarian attacks on easy money were always, well, where is the inflation? I mean, obviously we see the inflation. I had a discussion yesterday with a guy who commented on this. The inflation exists. The CPI is a little bit of a skewed figure for one, in terms of how it calculates. We've seen inflation from things like medical costs to higher education. We also see what they do with packaging goods. You'll buy the same widget or box of widgets, but they'll put less widgets in that box but charge you the same amount. That's a form of inflation. So what do you see happening in the United States? So do you see a Weimar-esque type of situation ever emerging in the US, or is that all just kind of libertarian fantasy?
I hope not, but I think you nailed it. Money has to meet three definitions in order to be money. In order to be money, it has to meet these three descriptions. It has to be a store of value, a unit of exchange, and a medium of account. And the ones that matter for inflation are the first two that I mentioned. So when we think of the CPI effectively measures money as a medium of exchange. If you had $100 worth of books last year, how many dollars do you have to spend this year to buy the same number of books? 101, you have inflation. 99, you have deflation. That's useful in terms of gauging the value of goods relative to last year, but isn't addressing the core essence of inflation, which is how much confidence do people have in money as a store of value. And what you then alluded to was you see massive skyrocketing medical costs, the way widgets might be packaged. You look at whether it's cost of education, even something like luxury goods, watches, art, gold, all of those things have seen over the past several decades, their prices skyrocket. And that to me is an indication of where inflation might be, what inflation might be closer to, that the price of those goods is increasing, even as the CPI is measuring it at 1.2%, 2.3%, like that kind of stuff. So where I see that potentially going, given the power of the Federal Reserve and the significance of the US dollar, it might be possible to play a game of musical chairs even long after the music has stopped. But there is a concern that at some point the chickens might come home to roost, that we do see, if that's the way prices are reacting for gold and art and medical bills and whatnot, perhaps that's going to be the way things will start reacting for consumer goods and food. I don't know. It could happen.
Do you think it hinges on the status of the United States as the reserve currency, which very well could be affected with the rise of, say, China or other possible currencies, crypto, et cetera? I mean, do you think, because that status as reserve currency, if I'm correct, means more dollars are actually in circulation outside of the United States, more dollars live purely in digital balance sheets. But if all that money was actually in circulation, the velocity of money would rise. That's where you'll start to see that kind of runaway inflation that we've always read about from history.
Yeah, it's certainly a big concern. And you mentioned the rise of China. China also manipulates its currency in ways that I'm not entirely an expert on, but they certainly do. Cryptocurrency as well. We're kind of at the real dawn of that. There's a lot of fundamental learning that still needs to be done. But that's expected to grow massively over the next several decades, impacting these discussions. The other thing to consider as well, with regards to the price of, we were talking about medical bills and university costs and all that, is the simple law of supply and demand. Over the last 20 years in healthcare, for instance, or even longer than that, 30, we've seen massive contraction in hospital beds, insurance providers. The result of that is a way less supply of any of these goods. While our demand is increasing, we've seen the expansions of Medicare and Medicaid and the population growth. So you have more people needing less stuff or needing more stuff.
More
but less
stuff
of it.
from a lower supply, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you wind up with the situation where that leads to price increases. So obviously the economy is very dynamic. There's a lot of complicated things, but the currency,
it's not just monetary considerations.
Yeah.
But a lot of that supply issue that you're talking about is also a factor of government. Obviously we have an older population now and it's more aging and needs medical care.
Yeah.
But you have things like certificates of need in order to build new hospitals, to expand hospitals, and then all the regulations that come with Medicare and Medicaid that have driven up costs, lowered supply. People don't want to get involved in the medical supply industry as much. Yeah. So there's a whole slew of things that also compound the monetary implications, monetary policy implications.
And on the medical stuff specifically as well, so many of our medical supply chains are actually based in China.
Right.
So many of our drugs and our medical equipment is manufactured in China overseas and has to be brought back here. So those were jobs and supply chains and whatnot that used to be in Ohio and Arizona and places here that now we no longer have access to.
Well, speaking on that, let's talk about some other tenets of populism within the United States, of course. I mean, historically, with Jennings Bryan, it was more of a. Would you agree that it was more of a left-wing movement? Would you say that?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say it would be. Jennings had a lot of social views. He was a devout evangelical Protestant, which would not be at home on the modern left. And he certainly wanted to imbue his movement with that Christian morality. But economically speaking, he was in favor of an expansionist, a larger federal government and the greater role there and more state control of, I think he even, Weaver, his mentor, advocated for the total state takeover of multiple industries in the United States, including mainly the railroads. So it would be a left-leaning populist movement that people on the right could find common cause with, much like modern populism is a right-leaning movement that many on the left can find.
Right. Overall, things have shifted left, particularly on social issues. But even in the 1890s, there was some common ground on social issues, and that's largely been eroded. And maybe you can point to that as the reason for major divisions in this country. That some of these areas that we all found common ground with in ages past are no longer sacred. But in addition to monetary policy, because I don't want to drown this into an economic discussion, but maybe some other economic areas. What are some other key tenets of the populist movement in the United States? I mean, Trump has really brought back to the forefront things like protectionism, which has sort of died out in both parties from the last 30, 40, 50 years, really. In addition to protectionism, he's brought back immigration restrictions, which again had largely died out in both parties for the last several decades. What other tenets of populism in the U.S. sense were kind of common between the historical movements and the modern day movements?
Well, I think that the tenet underlying each of the issues that you just outlined, and even though we'll talk about the US, these are seen in European movements as well, is the importance of sovereignty. That your country is not just a system of laws that you cross the border to Canada, it's a slightly different system of laws, and New Mexico, it's a slightly different system of laws, and the UK and France and whatnot. There is a spiritual connection that Carl Jung referred to as the collective unconscious. That's part of being a member of a country. There is that civic element to it. And what the populists of the 1890s were concerned about was somewhat similar to what the populists of today are concerned about, which is large multinational corporations kind of, if not riding roughshod over the laws and customs and traditions of a given country, whichever country that happens to be, in this case, the USA, but also using their perhaps inappropriately and size to twist the governance of those countries to suit their needs. And that, I think, is the frustration with that would be the same in 2018 Pennsylvania as it would be in 1890 Nevada, where the populist movement was large. I think that unified, and would also, by the way, work with a lot of populists in Europe, notably the UK with Brexit. France has actually always had a very high opinion of tariffs. For instance, lots of their France Insoumise is a far left-wing party in France, but they've always been a big, and their predecessors have been very supportive of tariffs. Spain for a long time was happy with lots of tariffs. So there have been various instances of that, but that would be my connection. It's the sovereignty issue that matters.
Now, the populist movement will focus first on the right. There seems to be some growing divisions between people who would focus the populism largely on economic grounds. They want to build more of a working class coalition. They want to shift to be more pro-union, and they want to talk about greater support for Americans as individuals, with stimulus checks and things like that. And there's another side to it that embrace populism more as a political tactic, but they're not willing to sacrifice maybe some more free market principles, and they want to focus more on cultural issues. They want to focus more on social issues. And of course, there's a hybrid between. These are not necessarily clean-cut divisions, but I know, some people have looked to Tucker Carlson as spearheading this new sort of economic populism, and other figures spearheading more of a populism based around culture, tradition, and sovereignty. Obviously, there's overlap, of course, but one is more economic and be willing to sacrifice free market principles that have really formed the basis of a lot of the conservative movement in the United States in exchange for, greater state interventionism. How do you find that debate unfolding? Where would you ascribe your views to, if you even are a populist? I never really asked you. And what do you see really winning in the end of the day?
Well, I certainly consider myself if we define populism as a discontent with, elitism and a desire to see a more egalitarian is the wrong word, but if you think of it rather than an ivory tower, that sort of government. Think of America. A populist America would be a shining city on a hill, and elitist America would be the castle on a cloud of Les Miserables. And I would certainly align myself there, where and on issues of any kind, I'll find agreements and disagreements, across the board with basically anybody. I am of the opinion that now that with Trump's position being not as clean cut as it once was, the new figurehead, I think, is going to be Tucker. I think he's got the largest platform, and he's got the loudest voice in that group. I think in the United States government, you'll see people like Senator Josh Hawley kind of taking up the mantle, particularly when it comes to dealing with antitrust positions. And I imagine that economic sort of populism, that more working class focused trade unionism is a part of that. I imagine that's what's going to head forward. And I should point out, I'm a diehard capitalist. You will not find me touching socialism with a 39.5-foot pole. But we have to make sure that, if the version of capitalism that's being pushed is, a large multinational monopoly is suppressing prices for farmers and miners and all that, while jacking up prices on the consumers and using that profit to buy an expensive lobbyist to get regulations that they want to keep competitors out, well, that sure as hell ain't capitalism. That's not what the free market is. If it requires a bit of wielding the hand of the federal government to remove some of those barriers to entry, to remove some of those anti-competitive practices, and in so doing, create a more competitive economy, a more dynamic economy, a free and fair market in which people can compete openly. Right. That to me is, in a long run, or perhaps net, much more free market approach than the zombie oligopolies that we seem to have now.
Right, and people seem to forget that there's a difference between being pro-business and being pro-market. And there's actually a lot of self-described, free market absolutists who would, attack me for being critical of Section 230, for instance, when Section 230 is really just a government-granted privilege, and it wouldn't exist in a free market because many of these companies would have liability concerns for stuff that they put out and editorialized, et cetera. So there's a lot of hypocrisy for people claiming the mantle of free marketism. And honestly, if I was, for instance, in favor of protectionist tariffs as the new source of revenue for the federal government, and I wanted to shift away from, say, direct taxes on U.S. individuals and U.S. businesses towards foreign imports, that wouldn't necessarily be anti-capitalist. That would just be a shifting of policies within a capitalist framework. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, and also let's remember the reason that the tariffs were used for so long, really until 1913, I think tariffs were the primary source of revenue for the United States, was that you had, the American people didn't have their income taxed, but if you wanted to do business with that group of people that had all this residual income, you had to pay for the privilege, and the tariff was the payment for the privilege of accessing the United States market. So that was the logic behind it. Obviously, there are different groups in society that would be adversely impacted or benefited by it. But I think that the willingness—
The same with any policy, though. Same with any policy, yeah.
Exactly. There are going to be trade-offs. And I think that when people on our side, on the general right from the center to the right wing, find themselves in a position where they're throwing, well, that's anti-capitalist, that's anti-free market, it seems a bit like what the left do when they hurl insults as well. What we want to do is, there are serious problems in this country, hence the reason why we've had such contentious elections for the past several cycles that need to be addressed. There are lots of people whose lives are being impacted by these problems, and we don't get anywhere by hurling accusations at people. What we should be doing is looking at different policies and seeing who benefits and who hurts, who gets hurt, and how we supplement those who are who might benefit and help those who might be hurt. Those are the discussions that we need to have, not sort of going, is this as free market as it could be? No, it's how is this actually going to make a benefit? It's as Marco Rubio said a few weeks ago, the free market exists to serve the American people. The American people don't exist to serve the free market.
Well, good on Rubio for that. I like to see that he's shifting his views along the more lines of maybe a Josh Hawley, et cetera. So there is starting to have this budding coalition in the Senate and Congress as a whole of new Republican populists who understand that it's good politics and it's good policy. It's good politics because it broke the blue wall and we've won different constituents that we never thought possible, and it's also good policy for restoring American sovereignty and our national glory. But I also want to touch upon what's going on the left, because it's very interesting that this populist development is happening on both sides of the ideological spectrum. We're seeing developments within the right, we're seeing developments within the left, and they're very parallel in many ways. The new left, led by people like AOC, et cetera, could be described as an anti-establishment populist left-wing movement. Obviously, they're coming at it from somewhat different angles, but there is some core overlap in terms of some similar issues. And if you remember, from decades past, the left-wing talking points were always anti-globalist, anti-corporation, and pro-free speech even, and pro-little guy, pro-worker. I mean, the establishment left of the Democratic Party seems to have shed those views, but now they are being, brought back up from the dead by people like AOC. Do you think do you think we're going to see a political dichotomy in the United States where it's largely a left-wing populist left and a right-wing populist right?
That would be interesting. If you have two equally powerful populist movements on both sides, would they even necessarily be populist? Wouldn't that become the establishment then?
Right.
But that would be an interesting thing to consider. I think when you talk about right-wing populism and left-wing populism, let's remember that in the aftermath of 2008, they had their origins at the same time. The Tea Party movement that became Donald Trump had it parallel on the left with Occupy Wall Street, which
you mentioned in the article.
Yeah, it's they're sort of prototypes of what the modern populist right and left are doing. And Glenn Greenwald, in fact, just the other day wrote a piece where he said, on an issue-by-issue basis, even if ideologically they're polar opposites, on an issue-by-issue basis, you're more likely to find agreement with the populist right and the populist left than you would between the populist left and the center left. That's a much bigger chasm than the center right and the populist right. At least it seems to me. So that's an interesting position to take. It would be curious to see. Certainly, what is concerning is that there is the term blob is used in DC circles to describe it, of people whose party affiliation, it doesn't really make a difference. They schmooze with the same lobbyists, they schmooze with the same big money donors. They'll say they use the same focus groups.
The Uni Party.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that one of them has an R or a D after the name, they're screwing over the same people for the same price.
Right. I mean, that's largely where a lot of the discontent has come from the great American masses against this two-party duopoly that has dominated DC politics and dominated this country for the last 70 years. And what's interesting? There was a video that just got shared recently. It was some sort of Chinese state official or intelligence officer. I wasn't really paying attention to who his background, what his background was, but I was paying attention to what he was saying. And he was describing the current state of affairs in the United States and basically the divisions of power between this sort of decadent elite, this mid-level kind of outer party in Orwellian terms that operate, the various different bureaucracies of DC and federal agencies. And then there are the masses that are just sort of clueless and are just being abused by everyone. And then Cernovich came out with a tweet today that I found was interesting, where it basically said, there are three new classes in the United States. There's the old elites who are basically dumb on the way out and don't know what they're doing. There are the new elites who maybe, if we're arrogant enough, me and you can describe ourselves as such, which is basically just like ahead of the curve, know what's going on, well-read, understanding of the current dynamics. And then they're just basically the masses, the proles, so to speak. Again, it all comes back to Orwell because he was such a genius. What do you think of that division of American society today? Obviously, it's in simplistic terms, but do you think that's correct, both what Cernovich was describing and both what this Chinese intelligence official, if he even was an intelligence official, was describing?
So I haven't seen the Chinese video or the tweet from Cernovich. Actually, I'll look them up afterwards. But thanks for explaining them to both me and to anybody who might be watching. It's interesting. I remember I had this discussion the other day with a friend of mine, just privately, that, oddly enough, it came from a Noam Chomsky idea, but I think he got what I'm about to say right. The thing about the old world was that what the Pilgrims and settlers to the New World left behind was that, everyone in the old world was kept in their place, but there was a place for everyone. You might have had a feudal lord and a minor landowning freemen or whatnot. But that place for the freeman was important, and it was the lord's job to look after him. And there was a noblesse oblige. The lords had to charge into battle and defend it. They had all kind. They maintained the ceremonial functioning of the state. So it was more hierarchical, but more secure.
Is this where Dylan Stevenson goes into a rant on being a neo-reactionary?
No, don't, bear with me. Well, we'll get there.
That'd be an interesting topic. I'm just saying. Anyway, yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
In the New World, he said the benefit was, no one had to stay in their place, but there may not be a place for you. If you came to the New World, you got to stake off on your own. You could make anything of yourself, but you also might fail miserably. And so that was the freedom, security distinction between the Old and New World. And what we have now actually is somewhat more the worst of both worlds. We have this seemingly aristocratic class of people, namely around the DC Beltway, maybe a little bit in Hollywood and big tech in California, who want to keep everybody in their place, but they want to make sure that they're the ones on top. But there isn't the same level of responsibility that they take. There's not that same level of duty that the old.
They're insulated. They're insulated from failures, and they're protected while people are prevented from making the same success in their own life. Is that what I'm getting? That's what you're getting at?
Yes, very, very similar. And so you have that distinction. I hadn't thought of it perhaps in a trifecta version of classes, but you do certainly see that division between those who have the right postcode and those who don't have the right, who have the wrong postcode. And for a long time, that, by the way, was a big talking point to the left, that having the wrong postcode could massively impact your educational opportunities, can massively impact your economic opportunities. It impacted the way your infrastructure was funded. And unfortunately, we've gone away from that concern for the little guy and sort of towards this strange, pat on the back circle in corporate media, which seems to me that the result of that is a lot of people, both poor whites in rural America and poor minorities in urban America, wind up left behind and abandoned.
And I'm glad you ended on that note, because that's another interesting point. It seems like at least the establishment left, but also the populist left, is trying to mask a lot of the economic inequalities in this country under racial lines, when it's really not a racial divide. Because when they've come out with basically, the concepts of white privilege and all this other sort of crap, they've focused in on inequalities only experienced by one group, but they claim it's not experienced by other groups. And that's where they sort of lost the working class white vote that kept their party alive for so long. I mean, do you think the left is making a mistake in focusing too much on race, when class does exist in the United States along socioeconomic lines? And class, I would argue that class is actually more unifying than race. I mean, I've already referenced this in a podcast yesterday, but it's this SNL skit, Black Jeopardy, where yeah, but it basically shows that the white redneck had a lot more in common with the poor blacks than either of them did with their racial compatriots of higher economic tiers. So is the left making a fatal mistake by racializing this debate too much?
I think the biggest mistake the left is doing, and this is the manifestation of that, is they view the economy and its ripple effects way too simplistically. They have chosen their cause, and everything comes back to that cause, and that's it. And that's really not the case. There are so many factors that influence an economy, that from government policy at every level to, as you said, factors of race and class, and to give credit where credit is due, gender, for instance, the way that your traditions have evolved such that people do and do not behave in certain ways in an economy. There are certain jobs that lots of people from different countries may not want to do, just as a result of traditions and upbringing. You have the impact of trade in one area of the country versus another. You have the impact of the housing market. You have the educational opportunities. You have so much that goes into it that to define everything by one cause, I think if they were to, I think it hamstrings their ability to get power, because there are only a few people who can relate to that single cause. But if they were to ever get power, it would massively limit their ability to solve the problems, because they'd be looking at this incredibly complex matrix of economic information and routing it back to one casus belli, and that would, to say hamstring their ability to enact change would be an understatement.
Now, before we conclude, I also wanted to touch on, the UK a bit and the politics there with Brexit, with Boris, with the UK's own populism. where does it stand now? I mean, do you think that the Brexit was kind of ended up being a sort of a mutilated victory where, the elites accepted it in the UK, but they did what they could to minimize its impacts, to make it the weakest type of Brexit, and to basically screw over the uneducated masses who voted for this against their wishes? I mean, what's the status? I'm not an expert. Maybe I'm describing it wrong. That was just my impression.
Yeah. So, in terms of the history of the United Kingdom, populism has never really been a factor there, largely because of a parliamentary system where you have executive power levied in the legislature, so it can be scrutinized immediately, and it's always scrutinized in a very raucous and public manner. In the 1930s, when Oswald Mosley was trying to lead the British Union of Fascists, he was written to a friend of his, George Boothby, a Conservative member of Parliament, wrote to him with what I thought was an excellent understanding of why thank God, fascism could never succeed in the UK, which is that it succeeded in Italy because Italy has a long history of secret societies and secret operations and lack of transparency, where this sort of thing could move in the shadows and gain power before anybody realized. And that the UK never had that. It's always been a very transparent and open society. Germany was able to succeed because the Germans have no sense of humor. When you see these, frankly, incel-looking losers standing up on a stage screaming about how much, screaming about anti-Semitism and how vicious and hateful they are, the response to these people is to laugh at them, and they're pathetic and pathetic weaklings. But in the UK, you always had a great, very large, comedic establishment, really going back to the 1600s with Restoration comedy as a founding genre. So you never had any groundwork for an anti-establishment of any kind, whether good anti-establishment or bad anti-establishment movement, to really work. The European Union changed that, and the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability and the lack of democracy within the European Union meant that for the first time, really, a populist movement and a sovereigntist movement was able to take hold. And that was led to, whether it was Farage's various successes with the Brexit Party and UKIP, before UKIP went insane, Brexit Party there, with the actual enactment of Brexit, with Boris Johnson's victory. So it kind of won. We voted to leave the European Union. Boris's, I think, negotiations are still ongoing, but it's not looking great. But we'll hold judgment until we see what any final deal might look like, if it does or does not materialize. But presuming it's a Brexit that largely is acceptable to most of the people who voted for Brexit, then it's succeeded. It doesn't need to exist until, and hopefully it will continue not to need to exist. But we'll see.
Another thing that I've been noticing, I wanted your opinion on as well, just on social media, there's always a lot of videos and stuff that comes out of the UK that kind of just points to this sort of soft tyranny, this kind of very much a society that, has a kind of this sort of police state vibe. There is a big government vibe, with the law, especially, and it really came to light with the COVID restrictions, where people getting arrested for not wearing masks. I mean, obviously this stuff is happening in the US at a regional level. Some states are worse than others, but it always just struck me as very interesting, considering, we owe a lot of our institutional framework and our the basis of our government and our society to the UK and your history. But it also just seems at the same time that you guys are on a different page in terms of a lot of this sort of soft tyranny type of thing. Am I wrong in that description? Is this just an ignorant American looking at it the wrong way? Because when I look at a lot of this stuff that comes out of the UK, I'm just like, I cannot believe that they put up with some of this heavy hand of government that even in the worst states in the United States wouldn't be accepted until recently.
And the term you used, I think, which is the spot-on term, is soft tyranny, or the soft totalitarianism. As we mentioned, I was published in the American Conservative. They write a lot about this, which is that you don't necessarily need legislative action to have the sort of totalitarian vibes that have come with states in the past, hence soft totalitarianism, which is socially enforced versus hard, legally and militarily enforced. And what we've seen with the rise of the social justice woke brigade, who are the anti-free speech groups, is that people are willing to, or a certain minority of people are willing to enforce that without the need for state intervention. And lockdowns have shown that actually, beyond that, there is a component in government that is willing to act in that way. I think that it's quite clear to many that Governor Gavin Newsom has perhaps gone beyond or certainly Governor Cuomo, Governor Whitmer in Michigan have gone beyond the realm of adequately planning for people's safety and gone into wildly overriding people's civil liberties in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. In the UK, there also seems to be that concern. It's a little shocking because one of the things there's that famous poster, which is in hell, the Italians are the police and the French are the bankers and all that. But in heaven, one of the things about in heaven, the police are British. And that was always a big pride. Police in the UK have always voted against holding weapons to maintain trust with the community. This is not something that's government enforced. The police unions choose to reject them. Whether they should or not is a different issue, but they've always made that decision. And then in lockdown, you've seen a lot of them enforce rules that are surprising. That it would be that I'm surprised that they would enforce. But by the same token, and this is less covered, you've seen a lot of police officers resign because they won't enforce these rules. There was an article in, I think it was the Telegraph the other day, about a police officer who explained why he resigned, and he resigned because he wanted to make sure that, much like the reason I joined the National Guard, the good people of your country can go about their business in peace and freely without being harassed by criminals or terrorists or whatever the case may be. To then be turning that apparatus on the people, on those good people, I think has jarred a lot in the UK and the United States. Even in other countries where we might not necessarily expect it, like Canada, France, they riot over everything. So who the hell knows if they're really upset? But I think that there are lots of places around the world where people say, okay, we were willing to go 30 days to flatten the curve, 30 days to slow the spread. This makes total sense to us. But now it keeps going and we keep being arrested for trying to put food on our table. I think a lot of people are becoming more concerned about that as time goes on, and will become more concerned as time continues.
Well, that's good news because every time I'd always seen one of the Twitter accounts of some local UK police department going after people for trash talking online, or their dog, or what was the comedian with the dog that did the Hitler salute? I forgot what it was.
Look, that's an example of it. I'm of the opinion that's an inappropriate thing to do. You shouldn't be teaching a dog that, but it's also clearly not realm for the law. Like I think he was Scottish, if I see.
Yeah, he was Scottish. He was Scottish.
And I, nothing but love to my brothers up in Scotland, but you're not exactly known as the safest country in Europe, guys. Like Glasgow's a pretty dangerous place. I would like to imagine that the Glaswegian PD or whatever, whoever it was that was doing that, had slightly more important things to be focusing on than a really tasteless joke made by some half-rate comedian. Like, come on, guys, prioritize this. So it always has been funny. I don't know. I always kind of looked at it in terms of, maybe you could comment on this, like a kind of conformist society or conformist culture, maybe akin to Scandinavia. Do you think the UK has that kind of conformist tendency where people sort of accept the rules, or are they are good rule followers, and that is good for a society at large? You don't want a society that's completely chaotic. I mean, I think the United States had a good balance between, individualism and, rule conformity for the most part, but maybe the UK was more on the side of conformity. Is that a correct analysis? Well, it's one of the reasons that we struggled with the European Union is that the UK, somebody made the joke that when an Englishman joins a club, he expects the rules to stay the same for the next millennium. That you say, if I make a deal with you to join Dylan and Gavin Club Hangout, and we have a rule that says no tea on Tuesdays, you better never ever drink tea on Tuesday. Like that's there's going to be a problem with it in English culture if that changes. Whereas the European Union, every 5 years, we're changing the rules, usually without any kind of public debate or whatnot. They just by diktat were letting us know that things had changed. So the UK, I think the British culture is that if they're very willing to honor an agreement. If you agree to terms at the beginning, they will stick to that. You don't have much. Any cases of sort of tax evasion and fraud and whatnot are really taken to heart in the UK. You don't have a lot of those necessarily. But when somebody is moving the goalposts while the game is played, that pisses people off. So I think that, again, much like at the beginning of lockdown, the rule was 30 days to slow the spread, stay indoors. And people thought, let's bite the bullet. We've done this before, lads. Let's get to it. And now 6 months later, 9 months later, we keep seeing the rules change and, we're going to have another lockdown. And actually you can go out on this day and not this day. And that frustrates British people immensely. So it's a bit of both, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Interesting. Well, we've covered the gauntlet of issues here. We started on William Jennings Bryan and the bimetallism controversy in the United States in the 1890s, and we ended on Scottish dogs doing Heil Hitler salutes. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but this was a fantastic podcast. I'm thankful you came on. I'm apologetic for butchering the introduction a bit. I'm still getting my legs here, but I wanted to give the last word to you. And if you had a place where people can find you, can follow you, etc., please let them know.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram at StevensonDS94. I'm much more active though on Twitter and Parler. Twitter handle is Stevenson for NY. Tweet it, you put in your links in the tweets for this podcast. Parler, I'm actually about to cross 14,000 followers there, so I'm super excited about that. Again, at Stevenson for NY. And I guess actually, if I'm going to close on the last word, one of the books I've been reading about sort of the populism in the 1890s is this book. It's called Skirmisher. It's a biography of James Weaver, who arguably is he mentored William Jennings Bryan. He founded the Populist Party. He was their presidential candidate for president in 1892. He was originally a Republican, a Civil War private who became a general by the end of it. Absolutely fascinating life. I recommend you check it out. Again, that's Skirmisher. If you found this discussion interesting, check that book out. You'll love it and find it great.
Thank you, Dylan. We'll talk to you soon. I want you definitely to come back on again.
Absolute pleasure, Gavin. Thank you.